Welcome back to NSSN News Primetime. I'm Nathan, and I'm here with Democratic presidential candidate Jason Palmer. Jason has served as an executive in leadership positions in multiple organizations, including Microsoft, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, and more. Jason went to University of Virginia and earned his MBA at Harvard Business School. He announced his run for president under the Democratic nomination this fall and beat President Biden in American Samoa, gaining 3 delegates. He was the first person to beat an incumbent president in a primary since Ted Kennedy in 1980. Jason, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Nathan. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Why did you decide to run for president?
So I decided to run for president back in October of last year. I was watching some of the Republican debates, and honestly, I was embarrassed at how they were screaming at each other, not being collaborative, not even talking about issues, honestly. It was just kind of demagoguing against each other. And then I thought, well, at least the Democrats are going to have some positive debates and talk about a positive, optimistic vision for the future. And I did a little bit of internet research and realized no, the Democratic National Committee had canceled all the debates. So that set me on a path where I said, well, how hard is it to run for president? I talked to a number of CEOs that I work with. I've been an investor for most of my life in mission-driven companies. And enough of my CEOs said, you know what, Jason, you should get in the race. You should make it so that there are debates. And by the way, I ended up meeting you at one of those debates that we helped produce.
Yeah, that was a great experience. And so you beat Biden in American Samoa. You gained 3 delegates. We'll come back to the delegate talk.
Yep.
But Tuesday, which I guess was April 3rd, there was Democratic primaries in a couple of states. You were not on the ballot for any of those primaries, correct?
That's correct. At this point, even though I won American Samoa, President Biden is so far ahead in the delegate count. He has almost 3,000 delegates to my 3 that it's almost like we're in completely different universes. So at this point, it doesn't make sense for me to be on every ballot, but I am on a few ballots. I'm
Yeah.
going to compete hard in West Virginia. I'm going to compete hard in Wyoming. There are a few other places where I have a few other tricks up my sleeve.
And so, are there any other states that haven't had their ballot access deadlines and where you're able to petition for the ballot?
No, at this point, all the deadlines have passed, but I'm still on the ballot in 5 more states.
Okay, so now moving on to sort of issues is immigration. You talked about immigration when you were on CNN and Fox, and you released a 12-page plan for immigration. This plan would prioritize a path for citizenship through Dreamers, and it would end parole for undocumented border crossers, and it would add more than 1,000 new border judges to clear the asylum backlog. How did you come up with this plan, and why do you think this plan hasn't been implemented, and how will you implement it if you become president?
Well, first of all, fantastic that you went out and read my 12-page white paper. I wish more people had gone and read it. I came up with it not just by myself, but I actually talked to a number of experts who've been working in immigration policy and immigration reform for a while and said, you know, what have been the best ideas that you've seen? And that led me to the idea of surging border judges, which I'm really surprised nobody has talked about before. And it led me to learn about parole and write about parole, which actually has recently been written about in the New York Times and elsewhere, where I just don't think enough people knew exactly how the parole system was working. Now, of course, everybody knows that dreamers are overdue for getting a path to citizenship. So that's always been kind of first and foremost. In fact, I said it's one of the things I would do on my first day in office if I was elected president.
So, would you consider immigration the most important issue of your campaign along with this election?
No, it's not the most important issue of my campaign. Like, I'm very focused overall. Most of the time, I try to direct the conversation to conscious capitalism. That's kind of the number one pillar of my campaign. Modernizing government, because of my background in technology and finance, I know how we actually can upgrade the government in numerous ways there. And then finally, the new collar economy, which is helping people upskill, get jobs, restore the American dream so you get to the middle class by the time you're 25 years old.
So, on your site, you included a couple of instances of use of AI. And since you come from a tech background, how do you think that the White House or any president or anyone in Congress should deal with the threat of AI?
Well, first of all, I think AI is an opportunity as much as a threat. You know, I used to work at the Gates Foundation for Bill Gates, and one of his favorite phrases is that technological change, very little happens in 2 years, everything happens in 10 years. And so right now, we're kind of in the hype cycle where everybody's talking about AI. 60% of teachers and faculty are using AI. Students are using AI. I'm using AI. That's why I put it out on the website to show that I'm tech savvy. And if you haven't gone to the website, I highly recommend go to palmerforpresident.us. We're only going to have it up there for another few more weeks, but you can actually interact with an AI version of me that gives better answers than I do. I'm too verbose. It's much more like straight to the point and it gives you the quick answers. And it's in my voice and it has all my writings loaded into it. Like we're using the best of LLMs. But in terms of the threat of AI, one of the things I talk about in the campaign is that we need to have a new department at the cabinet level, a department of innovation and technology. This is not the kind of thing where Congress should be having hearings and Congress should be coming up with new privacy regulations. Like that should be done at the department level, just like we have a Department of Defense, a Department of Commerce. We should have a Department of Innovation and Technology whose whole job is to keep up on these things and staff it with experts who understand the technology. That shouldn't be done in Congress.
And moving on to another technological issue, the TikTok ban. Recently, the House passed a bill that is going to force TikTok to sell to an American company in 6 months. It hasn't passed the Senate. How do you feel about that?
I think that that bill is overdrawn. TikTok is not a threat to our national security, although a lot of people talk about it like that. So there's a certain amount of kind of anti-China jingoism that's going on right now. I am comfortable with changing it and requiring them to have the servers in the US, which, by the way, they already have it. It's the CEO is a Singaporean CEO. That's a different country than China, actually an ally of the United States. Honestly, there's just too much anti-China rhetoric that's kind of surrounding the whole TikTok discussion. I'm more in alignment with someone named Ro Khanna, who's a member of Congress who opposed the ban. And I basically think we should do what Ro is suggesting. And I would amend the law in numerous ways to more support free speech, but also make sure that the US government has better understanding and control of what's going on with TikTok data.
Now moving on to some campaign strategy and into, you having these three delegates. So initially the delegates, it was 4-3. You won with more than 50%, but then it became 3-3, three for you and three for Biden. Do you know why that happened?
I do know why that happened. It's a little embarrassing to share, but we basically won 3.4 delegates when you average it out, and Biden won 2.6. And someone in the Democratic National Committee rounded the numbers wrong the first
Mhm.
time. And then they relooked at it and said, oh no, we should each get three delegates when you round those numbers properly.
So speaking about the Democratic National Committee, the DNC has come under scrutiny for many years, especially in suppressing non-establishment candidates. I asked you after your win on X Twitter if you thought that your delegates would even be counted at the convention. How confident are you that the DNC will do the right thing?
I'm 100% sure that the DNC will do the right thing, mostly because this doesn't change the outcome. The same, President Biden will be renominated. He will be the standard bearer for the Democratic Party. And, whether we get three delegates or not is going to make a minor difference. It just means President Biden will get elected on the second vote instead of on the first vote at the convention. It doesn't change who's going to be the actual nominee.
And with those three delegates, are you going to use them for any sort of leveraging to the platform? I spoke to former candidate now, Cenk Uygur, and he talked about how he was going to use those delegates to advocate for a ceasefire in Gaza. What are you going to use those three delegates to bargain for on the platform?
That's super interesting. I liked Sank, and I didn't know that he had actually said that. So right now, I have been using most of my platform to advocate for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, for recognition of the Palestinian state, Palestine, and also, but more importantly for me at least, it's recognition of conscious capitalism. I would love to see that become part of the Democratic National Platform. That's actually moving our entire system of capitalism to a more conscious, more people-based system. It's an area that I've been working in for the last 40 years, and I think it has the potential to really uplift millions of Americans and possibly billions of people around the world if conscious capitalism were adopted the world over. That doesn't mean the conflict in Gaza is not a serious issue. In fact, it's my number one issue I'm talking about on TV all the time now. But when it comes to the platform itself, I actually think we could get conscious capitalism in the platform because it's more of a persistent forever problem.
So you talked about TikTok in this sort of debate, whether these China hawks. What do you think the U.S. policy should be against China?
So China is our greatest global adversary, but that doesn't mean we need to be establishing a new Cold War against China. What we actually should be doing is trying to collaborate with China, try to figure out a way to thaw this Cold War before it already happens. Now, some things I totally agree with what the Biden policy is. For example, we should not be allowing certain computer chip technology to end up in the hands of China, certain drone technology to end up in the hands of China. We should be protecting ourselves against cybersecurity threats. Because they're our greatest adversary, we need to protect ourselves from a defense posture militarily. But then when it comes to things like TikTok, I do think people are kind of getting all whipped up over things that are about free speech as opposed to about actual national security threats.
And now moving on to a sort of domestic issue is term limits for Congress. You talked about together in launching an organization that is focused on new candidates for
Young
democracy.
people.
Young people, do you support term limits for Congress?
I do support term limits for Congress, although honestly, it is very difficult to get them implemented because it would require a constitutional amendment to make it easier for term limits to de facto come into existence. I'm in favor of having candidates sign pledges when they run so that they say they'll only be a member of the House for 12 years or 18 years, or they'll only be a member of the Senate for 2 or 3 terms. I do think there's added benefit from people who are there for a short while, but when you're in your 70s and 80s and 90s, you've been there too long.
Well, about pledges, Ted Cruz signed a pledge and even introduced a term limit amendment, but he didn't follow that pledge. A couple of other candidates, I don't remember their names, signed that pledge, so I don't know how beholden the pledge would be, but
That's fair. I mean,
yeah.
it's obviously better to have a constitutional amendment. That's why I'm in favor of it, but also you have to pick and choose your battles. What can you really get done versus, what are impossible things to achieve? And I do think term limits is the right policy, just very hard to imagine it happening in the current environment.
And a question about throughout this campaign. Throughout this campaign, are there any skills or things you've learned about the country that will change your life and you think will change the life of Americans if you share?
Quite a few, actually. The main thing I've learned is that when I ask people I meet on the campaign trail, what are your biggest issues? Three things always came back to me. Number one was job security, that they were concerned about their jobs being taken away either by, immigration or by technology, AI, et cetera. People are very concerned about that. So job security is number one. Number two was housing affordability, which I was kind of surprised by. I've lived in a house that I've owned now for almost 20 years. I've forgotten what it's like to be moving, renting place to place, that you have to put down a deposit first and last months. Like I've come up with a whole housing affordability plan that makes it easier for renters because I heard that from so many people. And then the third thing that I heard quite a bit about was healthcare issues. And it was always very specific. Like we have this issue with my mom, or we have this issue myself with my brother, my son, my daughter. So many people are still drowning in healthcare issues, and our healthcare system is quite Byzantine and really needs massive simplification and make it more affordable for everybody.
So do you support universal health care?
I support universal health care, but that's different than single payer. I actually think there's a better system that we can implement that takes all the advantages of the private sector and combines it. I call it Medicare for more, where more people could choose to opt into Medicare if they want, but they could also choose a private plan. And it's not that dissimilar than what exists already. About half of seniors have chosen to go into what's called Medicare Advantage, which is like a private version of Medicare, but there's a lot of devil in the details to get things simplified and make it cheaper that you can't explain in a soundbite, unfortunately.
And have you spoken with other candidates running for the nomination, like Marianne Williamson or Gene Phillips, now that he's dropped out? Have you been speaking with them, or are you
I
kind of
have spoken
disconnected?
with each of them. I have to admit, I admire both of them for different reasons. And yeah,
So, do you or did you have any plans to debate either of them?
yes, I wanted to. At the very beginning, my goal was to debate Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, and I'll tell your viewers or listeners, I tried so hard to get them to debate
Yeah.
me. So much so that I helped co-produce a debate in New York City. And I tried to get the debate moved all the way to New Hampshire so that they would participate. I tried everything in my power to make it so that there would be a great debate, because that is the number one reason that I got involved in this election, is I really wanted there to be positive, great debates.
And that's it for us here on NSSN, here with Jason Palmer. Thank you.